Hi again, it's Greg Hughes from 90 Second Website Builder. In this video, I want to talk to you about another form of responsive web design. Now, if you've watched my responsive web design videos, you have a pretty good grasp on what breakpoints are, variations, the idea of designing a web page to be responsive to fit any device by creating different page variations. That's what responsive design is and how it works in this software. But there's an alternate way to create a responsive page in 90 Second Website Builder, and it does not involve the use of breakpoints, and it's called the layout grid. Now, you may ask yourself, well, why would I do it any other way? The layout grid sounds great if I'm just going to make one variation. Well, the reason why it's an alternate way is because it's actually a little more complicated. It's also more limiting to you as a designer. Here's what I mean. When you create breakpoints in the conventional way of building responsive sites with this software, you have full control over what each page variation looks like on each device. If you choose to use this alternate method, you give up that ability to have full control for the sake of having it be a little bit faster to create your page, because you're not making a variation of each page. You're using a layout grid, which is sort of a flexible, fluid grid for your page. So let's begin by showing you a web page that was designed with layout grids. I'm going to click F5 because we're in the design mode of this particular page right now, so that we can preview it in a browser. Here's a web page that's made with grids, layout grids. I'm going to stretch it, and you can see it does respond as you would expect. I'm going to scroll down so you can see something more dramatic. So this is what a layout grid does. I'm going to shrink the size of the browser. Watch what the layout grid does for us. As we shrink to accommodate any device, you can see that the layout grid is very, very fluid. It's going to accommodate absolutely any device, and even by the time it gets down here, it knows to switch to a vertical mode. Now, that is really convenient because you're not having to create page breakpoints for this. However, as a designer, you're pretty much locked into designing your site within this grid, which may or may not work for you. So this site does look great, but it is limited by the grids that are on the page. Each one of these sections is in fact a layout grid, with the exception of this header up here. We'll talk about that later. This is just a regular layer. But from this slideshow on down, we're working with grids. This entire area is a layout grid with a slideshow in it. This entire area is a layout grid, as well as this one. This is a layout grid with 4 cells in it, etc. So let's take this apart so you can see how that works. So here I have a page with just one layout grid on it. It's a layout grid with 4 cells, and each of these cells has a text object, another text object, and even a font awesome icon. The way I made this layout grid was I went to the layout grid tool, as you would imagine, and I simply drug it out onto the canvas. Watch what happens when I add another one. It starts me off with a 2-cell layout grid. Now, I do not have any choice as to where that goes, except that it's going to fall under the one above it. So you don't move these around, they snap into place. Again, this is where the design is more limiting, but more flexible. So I can double click on this layout grid and decide how many cells I want. I can have as many as 12 columns, and I can decide how wide they are by stretching this around and do some other things in here as far as styling it. It'll have its own background if I want, which can be a color, an image, etc. Since you can't use forms in a layout grid, the standard form, you can in fact turn a grid into a form by checking this box. So it does accommodate that if you need to have a form on a page that's made with a layout grid. You just simply click this, and now the layout grid is a form, and you can drag your form objects into it. But other than that, the layout grid's pretty simple. It's just this grid of cells, anywhere from 1 to 12 cells going this way. So let me delete this one, and let's look at this 4-cell grid. I'm going to double click on it here, and you can see it's 4 cells evenly divided. It's set to be fluid with some padding around it. This is what it looks like when we preview. You saw part of it in the other preview when we were looking at that page, but just so you get the idea of what this does, again, it will accommodate any size browser automatically. You can see it's more fluid. There's not page variations. You don't need to make a 320, a 768. It has an infinite number of variations, which is great, but again, you're limited to sticking into the grid. Okay, so I think I've made that clear. Now let's take a look at how this works by studying the way this page was designed with layout grids. The first thing we did to design this page was we created a page header. This is the only section of the page that's not made with a layout grid. This is an actual layer. In fact, it's a very specific kind of layer called a page header. If we double click on it, you can see it's a page header object, which means it's always going to stick to the top of the page. We have it in the fixed mode, and so it will be our layer. It'll be our navigation. Also, we put a responsive menu inside this layer and had it centered right here. That will act as our navigation. Again, it's the only part of the page that we're using that's not a layout grid. So it's good to know that you can combine these tools. So then what we did was we started to add our grids. Now, when you add your layout grid, you don't have any choice as to where they go. They just snap into place under each other. So you want to kind of plan your website. It's not like you can put them all out there and then start to shuffle them around and reorder them. You want to plan what you're doing a little bit. The next section I wanted to have was this slideshow. So what we did was we grabbed the layout grid and we drew a grid and we ended up with this. So this is a layout grid that is one cell, and inside this cell is a slideshow. That's this right here. So you can see we just drug the slideshow object into place. In fact, if we double click on this, you can see this is a slideshow with 4 different images. Also in this cell and on top of this slideshow, we added a layer. This gives you some idea of what you can do. You can put things on top of things just like you would expect. But again, we're working within the confines of this cell, which is in this one grid. And so we have it designed in such a way that text is going to appear in this layer. Let's move on to the next grid on down. So again, when we add a grid, we go like this and it snaps into place, and then we can double click on it and change what we want. And then we just begin to drag objects into the grid. When you drag an object into the grid will accommodate it. So for example, if I want to put text in here and I just put it in here like this, the grid snaps to the text. If I put something larger in the grid, let's go grab an image. If I drag this image into the grid, you'll see that. And you can see we're in there because it's highlighting. The grid is now larger because it has to accommodate what I put in here. So the grid's flexible in that sense. It's going to accommodate what we drag into it. However, you can't drag and drop things around. They're always going to snap into position. We can move them like this, and we can move them like this, but they're going to snap into position. So I'm going to show you how to deal with that so that you get the full use of the layout grid possibilities. So let's delete this, and let me show you the one that comes under here by going over to this one. So what this is, again, it is a layout grid that we put into place. It only has one cell. I'm going to double click on it. It's just one full cell. But what we did is we have a background color. We have this sort of brown color. So it's just a layout grid with a solid color background. We also put in a text object. So we put this text and we drug it in here. And when we did, you can see it snapped into place like that. Now, the reason why there's plenty of space around here is because our text object can have padding and borders and backgrounds and everything else. Normally, when you're working with text, you're probably used to just having this transparent text, but actually a text object can have its own background, its own borders, its own padding and whatnot. And sometimes that's good to know when you're working with layout grids. So here we have a simple grid with a background and some simple text centered into it. And then we added another grid. We grabbed the layout tool here, or the layout grid tool under the advanced, and just did this. And again, it snaps into place. Then we can double click on it and set it to what we want. And that's how we ended up with this. Again, this was one that is 4 sections. And inside we've got some objects in each cell. So this is a font awesome. This is another text object, some text that's centered, and that's how we created this part of the web page. Then we just keep building. So we grabbed another one, we went like this, and we set it until we ended up with something like this. So now we had a grid here. With this grid, we put in a text object in this cell, another text object in this cell. But what we did with this one was we gave the text object itself a background, and this text object has some padding. So let me pull it aside so you can see. Put it over here so you can see it. If we go over to the properties inspector, this text object right here, while I have it selected, you can see it actually has its own background color and it has significant padding. So this is a text object in and of itself. Again, it's not transparent like you're used to using. It's an object that can be put into a grid and snapped into place. You'll notice when I took it out, this other one jumped up into place because everything snaps up. That's just the nature of the grid. It's going to do the responsiveness for you, and so that's how it works. So we go like this. If I wanted to change places with those, I'd have to take this out and go like that and let them snap into place. That's the basic nature of working with a grid. Let's add another one right under here, and then we end up with one like this. Now this is a great one too, because this grid gives us a good demonstration of what you can do with the background. If we double click on it, you can see it's just a single grid, but in the style, we added an image, so it has this nice picture of men's ties. But also, notice that we chose it to be a parallax. And if you watch the video about parallax, you'll know what that means. But it's just basically a background effect that you can put normally into a layer, but you can also put it into the layout grid, which is kind of nice. This is just a very simple grid with that effect. And again, another piece of text. This text has a lot of padding around it. That's why there's all this space. If we didn't have padding, this would be too snug. Again, let me take this out and you can see what happens. See how it just snapped up into place? We have this text object with white text on it that stretches the grid. As soon as we put it in here, boom, there we go. It's stretching out to fit this text object, which has a padding of around 50. Okay, let's add another grid. And when we added this grid, it's just a 2-cell grid, as you can see. I'll double click on it. You can see it's a 2-cell grid. On one side, this is just simply a text object. And by the way, this grid has that same brown background here, solid color. And then this is a cool little trick too. Remember that everything snaps up to the top. When we were putting things in, they snap up to the top. You may be wondering, well then, why didn't these Font Awesome objects snap up to the top? Well, because we created a little illusion. It's kind of a magic trick. We actually have an object here. We're just using it as an empty container. What this object is it's actually a horizontal line that's just been made really, really fat. Let me show you where that is in the toolbox. I'm gonna go up here. There's a horizontal line. Typically, you would use a horizontal line to just draw what you would think a horizontal line, but you can make them as fat as you want. So it actually makes a good placeholder. And since we made a horizontal line that's the same color as our solid background, we just used it by putting it in here. We used it as a placeholder. So this object right here, which seems invisible, it's actually right there. If I take it out, you'll see my Font Awesome icons jump up into place. So that's how we put that there. We have this object sitting up here while the Font Awesome icons are below. That's how you use the grid, or actually multiple grids. You'll rarely build a website with just one grid. Each of these is considered a grid, and each grid only has cells in it that go horizontally. So each one of these, it's important to note, is its own grid object. And that's how we end up with this great effect of fluidity. So this is actually a template in the 90-second website builder members area that you can download and look at. It's template number 20. And if you look at it, you can dismantle it and play with it and see how it works. It's a great way to learn how to use this tool. Let me show you one other trick that we did though. Remember, we did not use a grid here. We combined the use of a regular layer with a responsive menu. Now, because we did this, we had to make a breakpoint just for this alone. Notice that there is a 480 breakpoint here. And the reason we did that is so that our responsive menu would have something to go to. It has to be told. Since it's not a layout grid, it has to be told where to break. So what you're seeing here is a demonstration of combining breakpoint design as well as the fluid grid design by making a 480 breakpoint and by taking this object, this responsive menu, and setting it to break at 480 right here. We have the best of both worlds. So again, let's preview. And while we get this great fluid responsiveness, watch what happens to the responsive menu. As soon as it gets to 480, it does switch to this style menu. And that's something we had to use a breakpoint for. But by using and combining both of these methods, we get the best of both worlds. And we have this great responsive website. Now, you should know that learning to use the layout grid is a completely different thought process than what I teach you with building responsive websites conventionally. And you should probably, in most cases, use the method of multiple breakpoints, and variations so that you have full control. This is a little bit more advanced. What I'm showing you is a little bit more advanced, but again, it's more limiting. But if this meets your needs, it's good to know that this tool is available and you can make very, very clean, responsive websites with this tool in 90 Second Website Builder.